Hey again, folks. So here we are for the fourth in our series of pandemic lectures. Um, I'm shifting up the energy a little bit. You know, I like to walk around when I talk. I like to wave my hands a lot. I guess I was waving my hands in previous videos, but I am standing in my office. Instead of sitting, you can see some of my inspirational figures. Well, I guess I should point this way on the wall there. There we have Marcus Allen. I went to the University of Southern California. Marcus Allen gives me inspiration. Also, you'll see, oops, okay, I got to do this way. You'll see my Lord of the Rings figurines that I got back in like 1980 before there was any idea of Lord of the Rings movies or anything. So that's some old school pewter right there. Okay, so before I go any farther, so I'm going to be talking about Frederick Douglass, Cornel West, and I Don't Know More today. Trying to keep it to about 20 minutes or so. But I want you to stop right now, and I want you to get in the proper mood to receive what I am going to be dropping. So pause me just after this, go to YouTube, and either go to one of the two greatest 80s training montages well, in the history of the 80s. So put in You're the Best, Karate Kid. Watch that. It's like 3 minutes. Or the training montage from Rocky 3. And if you just put in Eye of the Tiger, Rocky 3, you then get Rocky's training with Apollo Creed. So I'm just going to stop right now while you get in your proper training modality and get ready to grab the Eye of the Tiger and demand the best out of yourself. So I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to keep waiting, so you better pause me now. Okay, good. So I assume now you are back, you are pumped, you have the Eye of the Tiger. So let's talk about Frederick Douglass. So Douglass is writing in 1852. Of course, slavery is still very much the law of the land in the United States. He is a former slave, an escaped slave, and he has a certain amount of praise for the American tradition. The American founders, who he sees as men of courage, those who opposed the British Empire and opposed monarchy, stood up for freedom, but he is not going to let them off the hook for writing slavery into the document. These are the same men. They did both of these things, and Douglass thinks it's important to recognize both of these things. Just because they did something courageous or noble doesn't mean that they get let off the hook as just men of their time, because being men of their time, it put slavery into the document, which has continued into the present, into Douglass's present. So there's no historical relativism here for him. He's going to judge them both by a standard that says, yes, we can recognize the courage and nobility in certain of their actions. At the same time, that doesn't mean that they just get off scot-free and get to be slaveholders without us trying to hold them accountable or hold the document that they created accountable. So he is offering a complicated strategy for interpreting the past, in which he is in part with it in order to be against it. So he's going to take some elements of the American tradition and work against other elements of the American tradition, that is the elements of racism and slavery. Okay, so that was my first slide, Frederick Douglass. The second slide, which is entitled, What Does That Mean? So what he is doing is he is giving his readers an imminent critique. So that means he is taking something and using the ideals of the American founding in order to show how those ideals are basically not being lived up to. So he's using the standard of the American Constitution and of the American founding more generally the Declaration of Independence, in order to show how some of those ideals fall short of the promise within those ideals, and then also how the practice of the present, that is, the contemporary American institutions of the 1850s, are also falling short. So what he is trying to do is not utterly reject American democracy. He's trying to show a more true account that takes into account all of the people who were subject to the rules of the United States Constitution. So he's going to try to show how the true story of American democracy should never have included slavery being written into the document. And so he's going to show how the Declaration and the Declaration of Independence and other aspects of the American tradition indicate to his readers, to the American audience of the 1850s, that that is the true version. The all men are created equal version should trump, no pun intended, should trump the slavery that is actually included in the U.S. Constitution. Again, important, there were several parts of the United States Constitution that accepted the continued existence of slavery and assumed that it was simply going to be a reality going forward. Now, he doesn't adopt a sort of nice kumbaya rhetoric, right? He's confrontational. He actually sees a positive role for ridicule to stir up emotions. So he thinks it's okay to shame people, to say, aren't you ashamed of how you are not living up to the ideals of your other documents, of the Declaration of Independence? Aren't you ashamed? So he says fire, thunder, storm, whirlwind, earthquake. That's what he's going to do to try to shake people up. So this is something that, I guess many folks today might, using these kind of tactics today, many folks might think that this is, overly negative or overly polemical. But the tradition of Malcolm X and many others carry on this style that Douglass adopts of holding someone's nose up to a mirror, sort of, not forcibly, but I mean like aggressively, to say, you're doing wrong and I'm not going to let you get away with it, and your best self doesn't think this is okay, and you ought not to let your best self down. So that is the rationale for his confrontational rhetoric, and he is doing it from a position of love and justice, but he thinks that that also means that you need to be aggressive in defense, or confrontational in defense of these ideals. So this is, this is not a how to say it. This is, this is a kind of fighting doctrine. Again, not physical violence, but this is a stand up and hold people accountable and confront them, right? Okay, that's a bit different from the rhetorical style of our more contemporary writer, Cornel West, who is still an American public intellectual and academic. And so he is certainly offering a more conciliatory version than Douglass. He's, of course, writing in 1994 and not 1852, so the situation is somewhat different. He is still worried about the legacy of racial injustice in the United States, and especially the way that after the 1960s and some of the real legal successes of the civil rights movement, nevertheless, both at the formal and especially the informal level, discrimination continues. And so now in the language of today, we would talk about structural racism. Of course, Black Lives Matter is going to talk about that, and I'm going to be talking about that in my next lecture. West is also important, though. One of the things that West points out is that there is a spiritual impoverishment. So again, critics of social justice types will say, you social justice types let people off the hook. You don't hold anyone accountable. You just want to point to structures, and you don't want to talk about how people need to sort of pick themselves up. But that's just flatly not true for many theorists, and West is a good example of this. West is as concerned with what he thinks is the coarsening of the culture in African American communities and the way that African Americans let themselves down, the way they are spiritually impoverished. And so he singles out kind of hip hop and a kind of materialistic culture that he sees. And in the 90s, this was really kind of exploding in popular culture in the US. And so there's a real kind of semi-conservatism to West's criticism here, because he is critical of the systemic racial injustice, but he is also critical of the way that African Americans need to turn inward and need to, really turn away from the crass materialism that American culture is offering them. And so he is as critical of much of sort of hip-hop culture or African American culture as he is the structural racism. He sees these two criticisms going hand in hand. Okay, so the second slide for West is entitled A New Language. So what he wants is a new language of democratic accountability to refocus attention on the public square. So he thinks that the crass materialism of American culture turns people inward, turns people just into selfish materialists. And so he wants us to try to shift our language, the way we think about what the United States, in this case, or he's talking to Americans most specifically here, but we can, think about the principle more generally if we're thinking about any political society, to, instead of thinking about ourselves and our own material interests, think about the public and what the public good is in this kind of public square where we come out into public, into the space of appearance where we dialogue and discourse with others, and we try to protect that public space. So he thinks one of the crucial things that is being neglected is the infrastructure, the material infrastructure. So housing, schools, hospitals, roads. Without all of those things, he thinks freedom is not actually achievable. So freedom is not just something where you can be huddled in your home. Of course, we're all huddled in our homes right now. You can't just be huddled in your home with, your family and your gun and your food, and, as long as the government is not coming after you or something, you're free. No, he thinks real freedom requires this public square component, and that means we need to have a basic infrastructure. And if we don't have those things, and I think, if we can think about how the public healthcare system is functioning right now in terms of the pandemic, you can sort of see that would go to his point about how important that material infrastructure is of having these public institutions, hospitals, housing, schools, roads, etc. But the next point is that for West, this is all in the language or is couched in the language of the Christian evangelical tradition. So West is very much a Christian, and West very much thinks, and again, he's following in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. here, and more generally the prophetic tradition in African-American churches in the United States, that the Christian tradition calls us, West says, to a different kind of we, an inclusive we, a we that is not just attentive to the salvation of our individual souls, but is instead attentive to this public structure, this public square in which we all care for one another. So for West, and again, he's very much on the left of the political spectrum, but it's absolutely, he thinks, in conjunction with his vision of what God actually wants human beings to do with themselves in the kind of spaces and societies that they construct. So, he was West was very taken with Obama initially, was a big supporter. He later, I guess we could say he has gone sort of further to the left in maybe a kind of socialist direction, in that he came to think that Obama was essentially a sellout. So he thought that Obama really embodied the promise of this new, common good focused we, and some aspects of that, let's say Obamacare, would have gone along with that. But basically, West came to think that Obama, through his failures to actually address the underlying capitalist structures of the causes of the Great Recession of 2008, that Obama was basically as beholden to the capitalist class as anyone else. So for West's later work, he really ties in this prophetic evangelical tradition with a kind of socialist message or semi-socialist message about the problems that capitalism specifically creates, and its materialism and its focus on people and just their self-interest, in the way that basically Obama doesn't actually escape from that tradition. Again, this is just interesting. Well, this is an interesting critique for a number of reasons, but one way is that it shows in a way how crazy it is, the claims from some on the right that Obama is some kind of socialist or was some kind of real fundamental radical. For most folks who are in the sort of medium to far left, Obama was nothing close to a socialist at all. I mean, he's definitely not a socialist. I mean, hopefully you've read enough, from our text and our various, liberal, socialist, conservative ideology to see Obama's, policies are not socialist in many recognizable senses. Welfare state liberal, yes, but anyway, so with West, you can see the way that works. It's not as much in this piece because this is an earlier piece, but later he has lots to say about Obama. Okay, so let me just finish up with a discussion of Idle No More. If I were if I had designed this syllabus a little more recently, I would have had us reading stuff directly about some of the Wet'suwet'en protests that have been going on throughout Canada. Not right now, but just had been going on up until I guess a few weeks ago. And I mentioned that at the end of the next one of the next slides. But I would have had some of that instead of the I don't know more. But I don't know more really begins this tradition of more assertive indigenous political thinking and political activism kind of on a wider public stage in Canada. So it begins back in 2012 with this as a response to this bill C-45. Again, it's very similar to the kinds of things that motivate the Wet'suwet'en protesters and their allies in 2019 and 2020. And the basic demand is that, for I don't know more, is that Canada needs to live up to its obligations, its prior treaties that it, countless treaties with various indigenous communities across the territory of Canada over the last, 200 years, even going back more than 200 years, in which the First Nations communities were essentially seen as sovereign communities. That's the way it was written into the language of these treaties. And so they want to, I don't know more, wants to return to a sovereign to sovereign relationship so that these First Nation communities are granted a kind of sovereignty, which also means a kind of dignity and a kind of respect and a kind of independence, which they basically lack in the present. They lacked at that time, and of course they still lack now. Like Douglass, I think it's important to point out, so this is my next slide, that this is not a demand for some kind of, it's a radical demand, but in a way it's not posed in a kind of a radical language. The claim for I don't know more, and again, this is true for contemporary indigenous activists as well, is live up to the treaties that you signed. You signed these treaties, the Canadian government, or the Crown, right before there was a kind of independent Canada. So you signed these treaties, live up to these treaties, right? Live up to the actual words in the treaties. So it's not posed as a kind of external challenge to say, from some standard either socialist standard or a critical race theory standard or, some other kind of theory. The idea, again, is just to say, look at what you, as representatives of the Crown, have promised to do and how you have failed to do these things. So it's about existing treaties and about living up to the promises of the past. It's not bringing in some kind of, alien, identitarian language or something like that. It's about identity or identity feudalism or tribalism or something. The claim is you signed these things, so live up to these things, right? So it is very much about returning to the actual language of the treaties and saying, respect these, right? So these were made on the basis of nation-to-nation recognition. They allowed for shared use of indigenous land, but the indigenous communities were, in most of these treaties, supposed to maintain the right to decide really to do with it as they saw fit, and that right essentially disappears over the course of 200 years. And so instead of equality, First Nations are subjected to all kinds of subordinate relations of domination, terrible living conditions. Hopefully you know something about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about the residential schools and the children who were taken and subjected to really terrible treatment in residential schools for hundreds of years. The essential Crown policy and then the Canadian government policy to essentially destroy the Indian in Indigenous children in order to sort of save them and Christianize them and turn them into good Western citizens. And, those conditions live in the present. So when folks say, hey, so when critics say to I don't know more, hey, like I didn't sign these treaties or I didn't do these things, that, these were things that were done to you in the past. Why are you still complaining about this? I don't know more's response is to say, no, these things are actual material reality now. Suicide rates in Indigenous communities are astronomically higher than in the Canadian population at large. Many Indigenous communities don't even have clean water, clean drinking water, right? The most basic thing that you need is access to clean water in any community, right? Me here in Hamilton, you in St. Catharines, wherever. Many communities don't have that sort of basic material capacity. So on so many levels, this is the lived material reality of injustice in the present that I Don't Know More is bringing attention to. So final slide, just kind of wrapping up this discussion. So in the context of Canada 150, there was a lot of pushbacks that, in 2017, there was a lot of pushback against Indigenous activists, but Indigenous activists were very much in the tradition. Again, they weren't citing to Frederick Douglass, but it's a similar thing that Frederick Douglass is doing in the, thinking about the 4th of July. What's the 4th of July to the slave? Well, what's Canada 150 to, to a First Nations community? Why celebrate statues of Cornwallis, who was a colonial ruler who dealt brutally with First Nations? Having those statues around is a constant reminder of past injustice that in effect endures into the present by the continued elevation of this figure as a person on a statue who needs to be lionized or admired, right, by having that statue. So it's a similar move that I Don't Know More is doing in terms of the way that they were responding to the celebrations around Canada 150, but this upset a lot of people as well who, similar to when Black Lives Matter protests around the 4th of July or the American flag, and they would say, well, no, you need to just, why are you dwelling in the past? Celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Similarly, I Don't Know More is saying, no, these injustices persist to into the present, so we are going to bring attention to this around the times when you're trying to celebrate Canada 150. And it's still a colonialist society. It's still practicing institutional racism against Indigenous peoples. And so, and in addition to the basic lived reality problem, the suicide rates, lack of clean water and all that, there's just a basic sovereignty problem. That's what I Don't Know More comes back to again and again and again. It's return sovereignty to us by respecting the treaties that you, the Crown, signed. I Don't Know More is seeking a peaceful revolution. It's not violent, although as we can see, some of the protests take a fairly confrontational stand. Again, going back to Frederick Douglass, the blocking of the railroad tracks with the Wet'suwet'en protests would be in that more confrontational style. Peaceful but confrontational, right, in order to bring a kind of national shame out into the open. I'm using Douglass's language, but I think it applies here. So we really have to ask, and I Don't Know More activists are asking us, what is Canada, right? What is Canada at 150 years, or now going into its 153rd year? How does the Indigenous, the I Don't Know More perspective cause us to think differently about what Canada is, and in and through the triadic model of freedom, think about from I Don't Know More's perspective, right? Who is the agent? Who is the obstacle? And then what is the program, or what's the goal? And I just mentioned in the final point there about the Wet'suwet'en and the land, them as land defenders, protesters are land defenders, and their allies and rail blockades. That's really in the service of a triadic model of freedom, of a model of liberation that is following in what I Don't Know More suggests as well. So this is of continuing importance. I know our eyes are on the pandemic, as they rightly should be, I think, at the moment, and the crisis that we are all enduring. But don't forget about what was just going on across Canada with these protests and the blockades. Just a very short time ago. So that issue will continue. What is Canada? Who are we as Canadians? And how do we relate to the history of settler colonialism, which persists into the present? Okay, so I'm going to close this lecture. I do want to dedicate it to the memory of an author who was very important to me and who just died yesterday of COVID. His name was Michael Sorkin. He edited a collection called Variations on a Theme Park, which when I read it 20 years ago, or I forget exactly when, but it's one of those truly fundamentally mind-altering reads that got me to think differently about democracy and public space. and how basically all of America was being turned into a theme park, but in just really rich, interesting ways. And his voice is silenced now because of COVID. So I dedicate this lecture to his memory. Please take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Okay, until next time.